Hello, Computational Thinking, Mr. Tennyson here, and I want to give you some tips on how to handle the Major Project 2 Option 2 Call Log Evaluator assignment. Before we take a look at the assignment itself, I want to show you what the end output should be for the given questions. That is, what calls occurred between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on any day, what calls occurred before 5:13, and on 5:12 were there more incoming calls than outgoing calls. So when we run the code, ultimately you should get these outputs. There are 7 calls occurring between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on any given day. On 5:13 there are 9 calls, or excuse me, before 5:13 there are 9 calls total, and there are not more incoming calls than outgoing calls. So you need to write functions that prove those things, and here is the text file that you are actually going to be given, and that's already on Google Classroom. Notice how all these values are separated by commas, and there's a sort of title row for these columns, quote-unquote, of data. Now, these aren't really columns of data, they just end up being interpreted as strings when you open them up, but you'll have to take a little closer look at the data yourself to figure out where you're going to go from there. Another thing I'll show you is that when you import this file into Replit, it's going to look like this, and I've got it on super big mode, so let me make it a little smaller. There we go. So that'll be what it looks like in Replit there. And in order to get that file into Replit, all you've got to do is go to your little ellipsis, go to Upload File, and then choose the file from your computer. So you'll download it off Google Classroom, and then you'll upload the file here, or you could just create a new file called calllog.txt and paste it in. Just make sure that your formatting is the same. It's really important that these new lines are still in place, and all that good stuff. If it's just one continuous line of data, it will be difficult to do this, more difficult really, so don't do that. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at the assignment. Okay, I had to switch my screen over here, but we'll zoom in a little bit. Again, this is due May 22nd. It's your final assignment for this class, and it is worth 60 points of mastery. So your goal is to develop a program that can read call logs from a .txt file, a text file, and parse some simple date-time information to answer these basic questions. And you're also going to be using the withOpen method to open up that text file, and I'll let you figure out which mode you're supposed to be opening that file in. There's only one mode, or well, 2 technically, that will work here for the assignment. There's a big hint right here on which one you should use. So anyway, the reason that I assigned this as one of the options is this is a totally realistic thing that someone might work on in the real programming world. It's a pretty regular task for programmers to write code that parses large data sets. We're looking at a very small data set here of, you know, just maybe 20 rows, probably not 25, 20 rows of data. But real programmers are always looking at, or usually looking at data sets in the millions. But this is totally realistic. This is something you could find yourself working on someday and making good money to do. So if that interests you, then there you go. Some hints that I've already included in this document are you should be checking out Chapter 10 if you need some refresher on the syntax of opening up files correctly. I encourage you to look at those April lectures regarding file operations. But of course, we're also going to be using date time, so you'll want to take a look at the May lectures, the very recent ones regarding date time. It'll be good for you to know as well that you can compare date times using the math operators. So we can, for example, and I'll just open up a quick idle here now that I've mentioned it, you can, for example, compare to date time. So we could say from date time import date time, and then we can make a date time object. Let's see, date or now is datetime.now, and then let's make a yesterday. So yesterday would be date time, and that's going to be year was 2020, 5th month, and it's what today? The 11th, so it was the 10th. And we'll just do this, and we could say that now is less than yesterday. That's false. Now is greater than yesterday. That's true, because obviously now, from a time perspective, is more recent. It's greater than yesterday from a time perspective. So you can use all those operators. I do caution using strict equality like this. This usually doesn't work out super well just because of microseconds. That's something I mentioned in the Pomodoro timer assignment as well. But you can use less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and not equal to pretty effectively. You're definitely going to want to use the split method at some point. And just a reminder, split is used on strings. So if I say X is kings, queen, or let's do kings, queens, jacks, and wait, that's not what I wanted. Not kings, queens, and jacks. I want spades, clubs, hearts, and diamonds. The suits of a deck of cards. If I say x.split, then I get a list from a string. I can also give split optional arguments. I could say, like, I want to split on the s's, and that would give me something very strange. But you can split on any character. That's very important for using or for parsing the data. Okay, you're definitely going to need to use .strip. Keep in mind that when we look at data like this, where everything's after a new line, if we were to, for example, if we tried to parse this as a time, maybe, and there's a \n on the end of it, that's not going to work out too well, so you're going to want to figure out how do I use .strip to eliminate that. Obviously, in order to compare the times that calls were made, you're going to need to use string parse time. Okay, don't attempt to do all of this work just looking at the strings. You should be parsing out date times. If you try to do it with just the strings, it's going to be more work than is necessary. So use the date time, string parse time, and I'll add that in here just to be clear what I'm talking about. All right, and then you're definitely going to want to use the read lines method or some method of reading in data, but read lines is probably the best. And some extra adventures here that you can embark upon. I encourage you to try to write the code as concisely as possible. This is an assignment that could lend itself to a lot of extra coding, so you could do some cleanup there using list comprehensions and good string manipulation. Make the program interactive so the user can enter the search parameters, meaning the user could say, like, what calls occurred before 5:14 rather than 5:13. So that would make it pretty interesting. And you can expand the possible parameters to search the call log. That is, you could include things like the phone number. You could include, I don't know. That's kind of it. Is really the phone number. Like, what calls came from? Well, never mind. I didn't change the numbers. Well, you know what? Go in there and change the data yourself and mess around with it if you want to. You could do like compound searches, saying I want to look at all outgoing calls that occurred around 10 a.m. You could do something like that. That would be pretty interesting to do, and also, again, very realistic to do. That's very real world type of stuff. Okay, so let's go on and open up a REPL, and I'll give you some tips on how to solve these problems. So I want to look at my document and my REPL at the same time, and I'll upload this call log. Okay, so I've got my data. My data should look like this when I get this thing stretched out. It should look this way. Understand that obviously this doesn't have any effect on the data. Okay, now one thing I would do to start is I would write down my questions. I would just say like Q1. Well, actually, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import some stuff. So I'm going to say from datetime import datetime. And then I'm going to open up the file, right? So again, I'm going to leave this up to you on what you need to do here, but you're definitely going to be opening up the file here, okay? And then I'd have like Q1. All right, so once I've got this thing opened up, I've got the data read. What does Q1 ask me? It says, all right, get calls between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. for all days. And I'll change this for all days. There we go. Make that a little clearer. Okay, so that's our question, and we might define a function just called get time calls. And the next thing that you're going to want to observe is that this should return a list of calls. So I can say pass here, but I also want to include a comment and just say returns a list of calls occurring between these times. All right, cool. Now, Q2. That is get calls occurring before 5:13. So that will be, I'll just say get day calls. And then this also should return a list, returns a list of calls occurring before 5:13. Great. And then we'll say pass here as well. All right, last one, your Q3, and that is get, okay, sorry, my daughter got some new clothes and she's like doing a fashion show, so anyway, Q3, right, that is on 5/12, were there more incoming calls than outgoing? And that is, let's see, inc out. I don't know, that's a terrible function name, but we're going to stick with that. And this will return a Boolean, doesn't need to be all caps, of whether or not, or indicating whether or not there are more incoming calls than outgoing calls. And we'll pass there as well. Okay, that's a good place to get started, just to kind of model your code out. And then the next thing that you're going to need to do here, and I'll just go ahead and get you started. Maybe the biggest obstacle is like, okay, I definitely need to be using split. So how do I use split here? Well, I should have some call data, right? I should have call data that came from here. And what's that call data going to be? Well, it's going to, or it should be, if you do this correctly, if you use read lines, it should be, for those of you that bother to watch this video, there, easy peasy. Okay, so I should have a list of strings. But if I have a string, right, I'm going to bring this up again. If I have a string and it's a string that contains these things, outgoing, phone number, date, and a time, it's very difficult to parse all of that at once because you've got to eliminate all this stuff right here. Now granted, you could do some slicing and it will probably work okay, but honestly there's just no reason to do that because I've separated this data with commas, and I've done that for a reason because we can easily use the split method here. So we can say call lists would be call data. Let's assume you've got some data, right? And we're going to split it on the commas, okay? And that's going to give us a set of lists. And then, you know, what can we do with lists that's so valuable? Well, we can say things like call lists 0, and we can access, for example, the outgoing text as opposed to the you know, what's at index -1 or what's at index 3 here, which is the time. Okay, for this one you're probably going to want index 3. Okay, now again, for those of you watching this video, this code right here does not work in isolation. This isn't some magic bullet. Okay, this is just an example. This will not work as is. As you can see, I've already got some red text. All right, I need to go up here and fill this in, but that's for you to figure out. So that's just my hint for you. All right. And the other part that you're going to need in both get time calls and get day calls is you're definitely going to need an if statement that is looking for those calls occurring between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And how do we access that time? 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Like, how do we make a comparison between those times? Well, the answer is that you must first create a date time object at some point. Then you have access to the time.hour. So you could say if time.hour is, you know, greater than 10, and time.hour is less than 4. That's going to come, or not 4, but 16, right? Because we're dealing with a 24-hour clock here. Make sure you keep that in mind. But you should run into enough problems, or have run into enough problems so far where you've run into that, right? But it is a 24-hour clock, so it's time.hour greater than 10, time.hour less than 16. Okay? You're going to need if statements on both of these. And this one's comparatively easier, I think. So this one, you're just asking that question of, what's happening with the incoming or outgoing calls. You should go in here and make an observation that on 512, let's see, so on 512, all of these calls right here, there's definitely more outgoing than incoming. So the question is, how do you access these and keep a count of how many outgoing or incoming calls you run into as you do this? For loops are your friend throughout this process. Once you get read lines in here, you're going to have a list of strings. So for loops will be your friend in each of these functions. I'll make another note. Use for loops. All right. That's enough hints to get you through. If you have struggles, obviously you can contact me every day between 8 and 10 p.m. I'll answer your questions almost instantly every night. Between now and May 22nd. Otherwise, you can just drop me a question however you like on Google Classroom via email, Slack, whatever, and I'll answer it as soon as I can if it's not between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. Okay, good luck with this one. And if you don't want to do Call Log Evaluator, I'll show you some tips on the Pomodoro timer in another video.